Press hockey coverage with Jim Biringer.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Full Press NHL Podcast here. I'm your host, Jim Biringer, the voice of Full Press Hockey. Joined again by Ted Starkey, Get Him Hockey Hotstove, Newsday. We're going to talk about it. We've been talking about it here, been tweeting about it. Alexander Ovechkin is coming back. The Grade 8, 22nd season National Hockey League announced it today, one-year deal. If you've been following the program, you've been following everything, you know this man, Ted Starkey, and I have been talking about Ovi's going to be coming back. A lot of people thought he'd be coming back. I had Victoria Matiash on, after that weekend when they had the weekend set with him and Sid. We're like, I think he's going to come back. The wave off of the handshake, no good. I think he's going to come back, and he comes back. Ted, what did you think of the announcement? And obviously, congratulations, because you were proven right. Saw a lot of disinformation out there on Ovi and his career being over.
Yeah, no, I mean, I kind of thought this year, I think we talked way back in October, I thought like if the Caps were decent, he had a productive season, was happy with the ice time, was healthy, he'd come back for another season. And it was weird, because I think a lot changed at the deadline because people thought, with John Carlson getting traded and Nick Dowd getting traded, that he may just leave. But, he kind of laid down the gauntlet, said, Caps, if you improve, I'll probably come back. And, obviously they spent a lot of money in the last couple of weeks. And, I think they finally said, well, we're done with free agency. So Ovi today said, I'm going to sign. And, that's what happened. I didn't think there was a whole lot of danger of him leaving. Of course, Monday, if he doesn't say anything, we're going to have a whole nother season of this again. But we'll see what he says on Monday. But,
because the release didn't say it was his final season.
Exactly. And I think it's going to be the same thing. I mean, I think the only reason you signed a one-year deal is that you could push $4.75 million into next year with the 10 games clause. You can't do that with a multiple-year deal. You could do that one-year deal. So he may be on a one-year deal for like the next 1 or 2 years. We'll see.
Yeah.
I think you're going to have the same parameter. If he has a decent season, the Caps should be back in the playoffs this year. And, if he thinks they can make another run with the Cup, I wouldn't totally write it out that it's going to be his last year.
No, I mean, all the press releases, I didn't say anything about final season. I'm like, yeah, we'll see what happens. But I agree with you. I think we've talked about this too. Like, I think there were a lot of hurt feelings. I think there was probably a good sit down after the Carlson trade and after the Dowd trade. A couple glue locker room guys at Ovi, like especially Carlson, him and I. And it's kind of funny, like all these guys now today are saying, yeah, I knew he was coming back. Like Boone Jenner kind of hinted at it. Carlson flat out said it in the Tampa availability. He's like, yeah, I knew he was coming back. And I think Dylan Strome did some interviews. There were a couple of players that did, like Caps players that did interviews throughout the offseason. They were always asked about. They're like, we don't know. They knew. They all knew. Like, I brought this up on a point too. Like, I'm not sure if they do Jenner and Desharnais. They were always probably going to do Tuck and Cairo, but I'm not sure if they do Jenner and Desharnais and Hall if they know Ovi's not coming back.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anyone like I said, I've covered Ovi for nearly his entire career. I know that it would be hard to walk away with a chance to win. And, obviously the Caps, even last year missing the playoffs, they weren't that bad. I think they're just wildly inconsistent and had some key injuries.
And he was the only scorer too. Like he's really the only off. Like I got the years, but like, and this is what we have to caveat too for the Caps. The year before, a lot of guys had career seasons. You can't do that a lot, like back-to-back years. And it kind of fell on Ovi again to like score. And I mean, look, the dude still put up 32 goals. But now you're adding Cairo. Now you're adding Tuck. You've got Cole Hudson coming. You got the Protas brothers there. And I think that had a little bit to do with it too, because you get to play with those guys. Like that's going to be a unit.
And you got to remember last year too, they weren't feeding him like they were the year before for the record.
Right.
They were clearly, favoring Ovi on the power play 2 years ago. They weren't necessarily doing that this year. It was everyone had an off year. The offense wasn't very good. The power play wasn't very good. So I think, adding these guys definitely will help. Ovi may not get the ice time he does, but, he may look slow, but he's still 32 goals is 32 goals. The only
and it's hard to replace. I mean, I think they did a pretty good job with Tuck and Kyrou, but it's still hard to replace 32 goals.
Yeah, and I think you got to realize if Ovi walks, then they needed another top six forward. Obviously, they ended up getting one in Alex Tuck, but you still, it costs a lot more. It was 10.5 million versus 9 million, and they're going to keep Ovechkin with. So, but as I said, it's going to be interesting. As I said, unless he definitively says this is my last year, I think we're going to have this conversation year after year until he finally quits.
Yeah, I mean, and I know, like we talked about, there's a lot of misinformation. So people thought he was going to do it this Moscow game, Fanatics Fest, this, that. People thought it was over because, they brought in Kyrou and they brought in Tuck. Well, no, they insulated it. If you guys have been, I think a lot of people need to pay attention to the fact that, like, he wanted to see improvement. Like, I believe was he on a 4-year contract that just ended?
I believe it was 2000. Yeah, I think it was a 4-year. I'll have to double check. It was a 4 or 5 year, but yeah, it was.
All right, but this was the same issue the last time he signed. Was he wanted to see the team improve, the team be better, the team have a chance to compete. That's why he signed that long.
Right.
And that was the same thing you've been talking about. The Caps weren't good. They needed to improve. And I don't think he has a problem with, taking ice time away from people. That's what all I'm saying is I think Carberry's talked about a limited role. I think he's okay with it. But I think their clues were there too because the GM, Chris Patrick, kind of tipped his hand a little bit and said, put the clues out there that he was coming back. Well, if he comes back, we can make the money work. We have an idea what the money's going to be. And then the next day, it's like, and even at the draft and here, it was like, we have an idea what it is. We just got to talk to him. Meanwhile, they were probably talking to him the whole way. And Ovechkin signs. And yeah, I think a lot of people figured he was going to come back. Whether he, like you said, whether we have to go through this dance again next year, we'll find out. But if I got to imagine if they win, he might call it a career.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, there's a couple scenarios I think he would leave. I think he just, obviously his health, if he's not happy with his production, but he's a competitive guy. He wants to win, and I think, missing the playoffs last year was a big sting for him. I thought, and the other interesting thing I thought they would have done last year is I thought they would have loaded up for one last run, and they didn't do that. This definitely seems like loading up for one last run. If it is or not, I mean, clearly they're going to be good after he leaves, if he leaves after the season. But this is definitely, they had like 30 plus million in cap space, and now almost all of it's been spent to try to improve this team. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do, how he does. But, he's a competitor. I had very little doubt he was coming back this year. I just thought that unless the team I thought was completely rebuilding, there was no reason he was going to stay back in Russia.
No, it makes sense. And I think Chris Patrick did a pretty good job because you have Kyrou on a longer term deal. Now you have Tuck locked up. And when Ovi goes, you have still a very good top six with those guys coming in. And like you said, they bring in Desharnais, Justin Hall, whatever. That's a depth defenseman, right?
Yep.
But like they still have a really good team. And they've drafted well.
Yep, and you got to figure, we'll see what happens with Andrew Cristall and Hershey. He was probably get a longer look down there with, but there's so many good forwards now. You've gone from a team that really had trouble scoring last year. You added, 2 regular 30-goal scorers in Tuck and Kyrou, and even Boone Jenner has a 30-goal season on his resume. So, that's a lot more potent of a power play than they had a couple weeks ago. And I think, if they can get the power play going, like they still finished with 95 points. They were not a very good team.
And they only missed the playoffs by a couple of points.
Yeah. I mean, you look at it, they flipped one game against Philadelphia in March around. They're in, the Flyers are out. And, in the Eastern Conference this year, you saw that there's no dominant team in the East. Obviously Carolina was very good, but their competition was not up to snuff.
No, and you mentioned the power play. This now takes away Ovi being out there for 2 minutes.
Right.
Like, he doesn't have to be out for 2 minutes anymore.
Right.
Like, you still want to give him $120, fine. but he doesn't have to be out there a full 2 minutes anymore.
Right. And then, like I was saying, he's definitely the eye test. He doesn't necessarily pass anymore, but 32 goals is 32 goals. I don't care how you
He still had 32 assists last year. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
he's the team's leading scorer. I mean, if you let him walk, yes, you're bringing in guys, but there's a consistency, and bringing in a guy like Boone Jenner helps the leadership in the room too.
Washington and Carberry gets the extension.
Yep.
They've done a real good job retooling this team on the really on the fly.
Yeah. I mean, as much as I criticized Patrick last year for being inactive, he certainly turned the tide around, in the last month, because he did more than I thought. I thought they would get a top 6, maybe a depth defenseman and be set with it, but they've added 2 top 6s, another depth forward, and 2 depth D, and they're a lot better than him.
You said it. He got the edicts from Ovi. Be competitive or I'm out of here.
Exactly. I mean, I think, and I think they were banking cap space since all last year. They were talking about improving, and they didn't do it last year. Well, they did it this year, and like I said, they had a lot of cap space because obviously Carlson went and got 8.5 in Tampa. They let him go. They let some of their other older guys go, and the only 2 guys left from that 2018 team are Wilson and Ovi, and so they're really rebuilt. And they're going to be a very good team. They'll be a 100+ point team next year, probably competing for the top of the division with Carolina.
Which is unreal. This is unreal. Like Washington was supposed to go backwards and they're going forwards. And they're better than some of the teams that are supposed to be competitive right now.
Oh yeah. I mean, you figure they had, obviously 2 years ago or 3 years ago, they had the season under Laviolette where they all kind of quit. Last year they just had the injuries, and I think they were inconsistent in their efforts because I think the trade deadline really kind of disappointed a lot of players, including Ovi. The debate I have is if they don't sell Carlson and Dowd at the deadline, does Ovi sign before the year ends? And we don't have this whole thing. But
probably.
Yeah. I mean, he clearly was happy because, once the dust settled, he signed. I was a little bit surprised it was that quick, but I think
it's the holiday weekend. How much stuff's really going to get done on Friday? Are people going to even pay attention to it? Probably the last big major news day. Yep. The National Hockey League will see. I mean, you never know. But again, I think this is just a good move. Again, I think people need to see it. They had to be better for him to come back. That was always the case. He put it on them. He said, "You guys have to be better. Be competitive. All right, that's it. I'm out."
Yeah, exactly. And, I think he waited, he basically probably talked to Patrick and said, are you done? So we know how much we have to, basically push into next year. And they finally got to where, after yesterday, they were busier than I thought they'd be. I thought they'd pick up a depth D. They obviously did a lot more than that. But he probably said, well, we're done. And the thing is, the Caps have ways to get other cap room if they want to add later. They have Charlie Lindgren has $3 million. Sandin's going to go on LTIR for a while this year because he was hurt at the end of last year. And then, you have another forward may go, a guy like Beauvillier or Frank, where there may not necessarily be room for on the roster anymore. And they're still not over the cap. They're just, they're obviously about $1 million left, but, they could probably squeeze out another $5 or $6 million if they absolutely had to.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned it before. We'll go around now that we've touched on Ovi and we get one more. If we get a year, maybe we'll get more from both guys. I don't know. We'll see. Sid and Ovi keep going until I think it feels like they'll retire together. I don't know. They came into the game.
I mean, the one thing they got to do is they got to have the Caps and Penguins again at the end of the year.
Yeah, that we just need that again. I
think
that's the best way to do it.
Yep. I mean, and obviously, I would hope for some clarity, but I don't think we're going to get it in terms of, a farewell tour or something like that. As I said, I highly doubt he commits to anything before, say, the All-Star break next year.
Yeah.
I mean, he could, but, unless he falls off the table, I think he's seriously going to reconsider coming back for next season as well.
Yeah. No, it's going to be interesting. And you mentioned John Carlson before. He was in Anaheim, told Anaheim, we talked about in previous videos, not going. It's figured, he's going back east. Tampa was a leading favorite, but he got his rights traded to Carolina. Carolina got their prospect back, but there was this negotiation going on. Once he didn't sign, I was like, okay, he's probably going to free agency. Carolina has a certain price point they're not going to go past. They didn't want to do it. A lot of reports out there say he was looking for similar. He got a $500,000 pay raise off of what he was making. And I don't think Carolina wanted to go that high, and I don't think they wanted to go as high as $8 million either. And I think they just work inside a cap structure, especially with an older guy. I don't think they want to do that. So he ends up going to Tampa, where he was probably going all along, 2 times 8.5. And all these reports about $9 million, 10, he wasn't getting that. Like, no competitive Eastern Conference team was going to be able to pay him that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the move for Carolina was to try to see if they could convince him to take a little bit more money at the back end, maybe have a 3 or 4 year deal with the intention of, maybe he plays 2 years, but you can lower the cap hit that way. Cause they only have a little bit over 10 million in space, and you really can't have John Carlson taking up almost all your available space. And, obviously there's rumors, last year, I think Washington wanted him to come back at a discount, and he didn't want to do that. So they ended up trading him. And then I think, Philadelphia, they had room, but I think, Carlson probably wanted a chance to see if he can win another cup, like Ovi. Obviously Florida's tax-free versus Pennsylvania or North Carolina, so that offsets it a bit. But, we've talked about before. Carlson's probably good for about a year. Next year after this one, all bets are off and how good he's really going to be. His defense has fallen off. His offensive prowess isn't what it used to be either.
Right.
So, I don't think the Caps really missed a lot getting, moving on from him and using that space for other reasons.
No, I think the Caps had a great free agency, great draft. Thought they did really well. I'm a little bit, stay in this area for a minute. Head scratching with the New York Rangers. Like, I like some of their moves, but some of their moves left me wondering, like, what is your direction? Like, you traded Trocheck, fine. You got Dursey back and Cole Boudouin. That's a really good prospect from everybody I've been told. And you get a pick and all that stuff. Okay, great. You bring in Dursey, you bring in Marcus Pettersson. Basically, Vancouver just said, all right, get rid of him. You got Dorofeev at the draft. You signed him to $11 million. But then you traded for Jonas Korpisalo. And you moved Borgen for, picks. You had Dylan Garand there. That one left me wondering, what are we doing?
Yeah, no, it seems like every time they take a step forward, they take a step back. There's no, like you were saying, there's no direction to what they're trying to do. I think they change out to change out. And, when you're trying to import Vancouver Canucks to be your turnaround, that's probably not going to be the best strategy for you in the long run.
No, I mean, I know Pettersson played under Mike Sullivan in Pittsburgh, so I get the familiarity there. But Korpisalo, it's like Drury was saying, there's a skill set that he has that we didn't have. I'm like, yeah, but you had Dylan Garand. You had a young backup goaltender. That you should be okay with that.
Yeah, no, I really don't, it's funny too, because, you talk about under the Dolan ownership, it's kind of better when he's distracted, and you think there'd be no better distraction in the mix. But
he's got the itch. He's got the itchy hands now, Ted. He's got the itchy hands now. He wants to win. This was his problem years ago when Jeff Gordon was there and John Davidson. They started doing things the right way. There was patience, and then we made this COVID bubble, and then we got to blow everything up.
Yeah, no, it just seems like they kind of fly by the seat of their pants. There's really no strategy going on. Like you said, ever since COVID, they built a really good team. They had one run to the Eastern Finals, and it's just like they slowly have slipped backwards every year since they went that far. And the East is going to be better next year. Clearly this is kind of an anomaly with the East being this thin. I think you're going to have a lot of teams that are going to look better. The division's going to be better, and even in the year where Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were in, they couldn't make a run at the playoffs, and I don't think they're any closer now than they were then.
No, they haven't. I mean, maybe Toronto's a little bit closer because, look, they really went to town on their roster. Like the roster changes in Toronto. I mean, look, John Chaika not messing around. Helps when you get Gavin McKenna, sure. But you bring in Bobrovsky. We'll get to Florida in a minute. Bring in Bobrovsky. You know, you moved out your D, Carlo. You're bringing in Mil Andre. You got Darren Radish there. Reshaped your bottom six. Like, John Chaika really reshaped this roster for Jim Hiller, and some guys may not have roster spots. Like, you feel bad for a guy like Max Domi who, has some complications from surgery, and you hope he's all right. But the way they constructed this team is like, where's he fitting in on this roster right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's Toronto is basically just trying to take a swing and see. We're going to shake up the table, change up the roster, and see if it works. It may work, it may not, but it's certainly they're not for lack of trying. Obviously Bobrovsky is going to be. He obviously has not been quite what he was, but he's still better than what Toronto had in net. But, again, he's going to be one of these guys. How much does he have left, and how will he do against a still pretty bad Toronto defense? But
yeah, I mean, look, you have Radish there. If Tanev's healthy, that's huge. You got OEL there. Yeah, I know there's familiarity with Stolars and a couple like Lorenz and stuff. I mean, Nick Paul, you traded for him. Like, they weren't messing around. They may not be done. And look, but that division's still competitive. Montreal's not going away. Tampa's still going to be there, right? Florida got better. Florida bringing in Brady Tkachuk. Then you add Jacob Markstrom. Bring in Radko Gudas. Bring in some depth guys. Like, Florida basically was like, okay, we want Bob at 2x6. He's not going to do it. We'll go get the guy that's at 2x6. We'll get him. He's going to be our starting goaltender. With this defense, no one's going to get to him. Bring in Akira Schmid. Make all these little subtle accessory moves. And I think, I know Bill Zito, and he's not going to say anything bad in the media. He's not going to talk disparagingly about players. He even said it's time to move on. Circumstances, people move on. Situations. The negotiations were contentious. Panthers went as far as they could go. They said, dude, we're not going that high on an aging goaltender.
Right.
And they moved on.
Yep. And you look at it too is, obviously a team like Florida can really punish you. And, a lot of it is they wear down teams, in a playoff series, which is why they've been so effective. And, honestly, that's why the playoffs are different this year because, Carolina never played a team that really ground them down like the Panthers had a couple of years ago. So it's kind of like they're like, the goaltending was good, but, they feel like their defense can limit enough chances and, give their goal like Carolina did with Anderson. Anderson wasn't the best goalie, but, he didn't face a lot of chances during the playoffs. And the Panthers think they could play that kind of style. And, obviously, Markstrom never really produced in New Jersey. So, kind of a fresh scenery for him. So we'll see how he does. Maybe they'll platoon him a bit more, but obviously Markstrom got hurt and he never really seemed to gel behind that defense.
No, it was makeshift defense in New Jersey, and I think he just needed to change the scenery. They moved on from him, moved on from Nemec, got some assets in New Jersey, made the offer sheet to Barrett Hayden, which was impressive. I'm wondering if this will come out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We'll find out. I do wonder if Nashville sent one to Maverick Bourque, and that facilitated the trade. Like, my gut tells me it is, and one person told me that it probably happened, and Nashville was going to be the team to do it. But Nashville, I was really impressed with what Chris McFarland's really doing. Like, that was a big thing to me under Barry Trotz, and like, I think Trotz is a great guy. I think Trotz is a great coach. Just didn't have time to be a manager, but he traded away too much young talent that could help him right now, and McFarland's getting that young talent back. And I really like the additions of Jack Drury. You get Maverick Bourque. You're bringing in Ross Colton. Like, he's putting in some work there in Nashville.
Yeah, no, and I think, Trotz he swung big his first offseason, getting Stamkos and trying to improve that way. And it just never seemed to be a fit. And now I think they're trying to build a little bit more of a team. And it's interesting with the offer sheets. Obviously, you're probably not going to get a top player with an offer sheet. but you can certainly get some depth guys because, a second rounder is nothing for a solid player, even for a 1-year deal. And,
No,
you're not going to get a guy, you're not going to get a guy at a top contract. You give up that many first rounders, but, second rounder, why not? You get it for 1 year, give him the no trade, basically he's set, he's happy. And, maybe Utah decides to keep him, but, it may depend if he's in their plans or not. If he doesn't, New Jersey gets a good player for a second rounder, and that's a win for them.
and you almost wonder if there's the reports are that there was a trade in place at the draft and Utah backed out of it. I think Sonny Meta, what he was talking about today, he's trying to follow the Florida model, take chances on guys that are being underutilized and find them and platoon them somewhere. Montreal did that for years. They took a risk on Line. They've taken a risk on Newhook. They took risk on guys and it's paid off. Kirby Doc, even though his injury history. But they're doing it with guys. And it was real interesting to hear Sonny say, hey, if I'm trading Markstrom, I have to get my guy Evan Rodriguez. I got to get these guys that I brought to Florida to help win us championships. And I like that aggressiveness out of Sonny Meta because New Jersey Devils now have a plan in the offseason. I think the same applies that you said to Barry Trotz to kind of like Tom Fitzgerald. Oh, let's go get guys or change things just to change things, what the Rangers are doing. But it kind of put the team backwards, and you had to reset things every offseason.
Yep. And I think, like we've talked before about, under the new cap, teams can keep the players they want. The guys who are getting traded are guys who just want to get rid of the contracts or they don't fit in their plans because, it's not the days of teams not being able to keep players because they can't afford them are over. That used to be a big driver for trades is, well, we can't afford this guy, so we're going to move him on. Get what we can for him. Teams don't have to do that anymore. Now it's like, well, we want to move this guy or we want to move this contract because it's a little bit too much or he doesn't fit in. So that's where you get. So you kind of have to look for those, slightly damaged players who you think you will do better in your own system. And, I think teams are looking for that because, that's the way to do it.
No, it is the way to do it. I mean, we saw Calgary move their guys out. All the guys that were on the block, like the Blake Coleman's now just got traded to Minnesota for a return. Hey, everybody can see the return online, but you see, for instance, Darnell Nurse was a big talking point in Edmonton. They were like, oh, well, he only wants to go to Philly or Boston or this and that. Reports are Boston had a deal with Darnell Nurse. Player was Nikita Zadorov, who said, no, I'm exercising my no trade clause. He doesn't want to go back to Canada. I don't blame him. He left Vancouver for a reason. I think it just didn't work out. But Darnell Nurse, people are talking so highly of San Jose. We know they're coming. Had a great draft. You get Stenberg, you get Verhoff, you get Lynn, you get all those guys. Mike Greer's doing great work. Trade for Darnell Nurse. You sign Mason Marchment. You sign Jacob Trouba. And Nurse was people were telling him, no, San Jose is a destination. You want to go there. Because originally he didn't want to go there. And then he gets traded there, from Mohamed Doolin and Sharp. But that's just Edmonton just trying to offload this contract. And I think it's going to be the Keandre Miller situation. I think as much as I've been critical of Darnell Nurse, I think in San Jose he'll be just fine. And he'll be the guy that everybody expects him to be.
Yeah, and you're going, obviously going to a place like San Jose from Edmonton, the pressure is a lot less. You're not facing, any Canadian market. There's so much of a spotlight on players, and some players just don't play well under the spotlight. They like to go to a team like San Jose or somewhere they don't have, or Los Angeles, where, if they make a bad play, they don't hear about it for the next year from the local fans. And I think, San Jose obviously has got a really good young club, and even with his contract, with the new cap, even $9.25 million is not what it used to be.
No.
High, but it's not prohibitive anymore. Yeah, obviously, I think we were talking about how, in a couple of years, you can fit 23 guys making $5 million under your cap and still have room, which is, shows you where the market's going. It's just, an average contract will be 5. So 9.25 is not that much over. And it's just, people are all this year all fired up about these deals. It's like, you got to realize you're basically at a 25% discount of,
Yeah.
everything. If it's an 8 million deal, it's probably like around 6 under the old cap, just because, we're going from 90 to 120 in a couple of years. And it's just going to change, the next couple of years, it's going to change drastically as teams can keep the guys they want.
No, it's true. And Edmonton brings in Ryan Shea, Freddie Anderson. That goaltending, not good, but it's better. But the thing with Anderson, we talked about this in the playoffs. He was protected. He was in a system. When he was in Toronto and Anaheim, he had to work more. He's going to have to work. That you bring Devin Levi. Yeah, you have Kapanen. What are the Oilers? Are the Oilers a playoff team? Are they still good? Are they competitive? I know everybody says their goaltending is better than it was, but again, is your team defense better than it was this past season? I'm
Right.
still not sold on Mike Babcock.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think he's a big question because, obviously he's a lightning rod. Some players don't mind him. A lot of players don't like him at all. And, obviously with McDavid nearing the end of his deal, where's this team going? Obviously guy like Devin Levi, he kind of got burned in Buffalo because he's playing again, I get behind a bad defensive core. And, now in Edmonton, they're not going to be a whole lot better. He's a very, very good goalie with a lot of talent, but, you put him in a bad situation again. Buffalo gave him every chance to be the starter, and he just did not accept it. And it's going to be interesting. And the same, obviously with Freddie, he was obviously hurt. Over the last couple of years. And, like I said, he had a nice playoff run until the final, but, he was facing, limited amount of shots where that won't be the case in Edmonton, especially in the West. He's going to face teams like Colorado and Dallas and, rebuilt Kings, the Sharks. All these teams are going to pour a lot of shots on him, and this will be interesting to see how he does. And again, he went to a market from, there wasn't a whole lot of pressure on him in Carolina. The fan base is very supportive of what the team does. And then you go to a place like Edmonton, who's starving for a cup. That's a whole different ball of wax.
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked with some Florida people. Bob didn't live up to that contract early on in the regular season. I know it's only $7 million, but if he has some rough games up there, the noise is going to get a lot louder than it did in Florida. He's flown under the radar in Columbus and Florida for some poor performances. He didn't fly under the radar in Philly. He's definitely not flying under the radar in Toronto.
Again, if you have a bad game in Florida, you can go home. You won't hear another thing about it. Toronto will be all over the back pages and all over talk radio. So, it's a whole different focus, and it'll be interesting to see how these guys do. Obviously a guy like Markstrom will probably do well. Obviously, Florida is it's a low pressure place to play, especially with the success they've had. Fans are pretty content. But going to Canada is a whole different ball of wax because, if you can't handle a lot of pressure, it's not the place for you.
No. A couple more things before we wrap up. What is your take on the Zach Werenski Columbus situation? Kind of weird because it felt like there was a fallout, then they had a talking, then there was a fallout, and then everybody's kumbaya, but is everybody kumbaya? Because it feels like Don Waddell basically was like, okay, you want to be traded? I'm trading you to Dallas. Oh, well, I don't want to be traded to go to Dallas. This is where I want to go. I was like, well, no. You said you wanted out. This is where I want to make a deal. I'm getting a good asset back. And then he backed out and said, all right, well, Columbus is for me. It's just a weird situation.
It is. I mean, I'm sure it's just the direction of the team. I mean, I know 2 years ago after the Johnny Gaudreau tragedy, they kind of built together and banded together. Last year was more of an off year. And, I don't know how much direction there really is with that franchise. And I'm sure he's just getting frustrated, especially, you see the other teams in the division are getting better. I think, maybe he just wanted to kind of make a statement to say, we need to get better too. And they kind of interpret it as, well, you want out of here. It could be one of those things that you say, like Ovi, if you don't improve, I don't want to be here next year. And maybe he took it a little bit too literally, but it's probably not a great situation either. He had such a good year last year for a very also ran team. And, obviously Columbus knows they can get a lot back from him at this moment, coming off his season. But, it's probably just something that, frustration on his part. And, the team doesn't seem to be really moving forward. And we'll be interested to see what they end up doing the rest of the offseason and where this goes.
No, absolutely, yeah, because Marchenko's still there. He seems there's a belief that he'll be there in October, but teams have been calling on him. Jason Robertson in Dallas feels like they want to get that done. Maybe an offer sheet comes, maybe it does. It feels like they want to get that done. He wants to stay there. Rejected the Seattle trade, rejected a couple others. Feels like he wants to stay in Dallas. What do you think that final number comes in for Robertson?
Well, it's going to be interesting because, obviously now you're more limited in what you can offer because, before you could offer an 8-year deal if you do a sign and trade. Now you're only able, Dallas can do, I believe, 7 and every other team can do 6. So, maybe it's a sign and trade. I mean, he's still going to get a lot of money because, he's relatively young. He can score. I mean, my gut, I think his situation's pretty good in Dallas. I think it's just obviously the Stars are going to have to make changes to keep him, but I'd still, it's going to be 12, 13. They'll probably find a way to try to spread it out as much as they can. Obviously, it's a little tougher now because you
Yeah.
have less of a year to deal with. Or, it's like that 8-year deal was really good for teams because you can really, back end a deal and, yes, you can accept the player may not be what he is in year 8, but you're also not using up quite the cap space you would having to sign him to a 7 or a 6. And now you don't have that option. So, yeah, I think he may end up staying just because I think it doesn't sound like he wants to go anywhere, and
No, he
I
wants to go to a
think
place where he
Dallas
can
kind of
win.
yeah. So and how many teams are really can afford him anyway? I mean, that's the thing. It's like you look at a lot of the teams now. Almost everybody's almost at the cap. So it's like you're limiting. Dallas would have to take money back to really be able to make a deal work, unless they have a third team involved. It just gets a lot more complicated. So it'll be interesting to watch. Obviously he was the guy everyone was watching this summer, and like you were saying, Seattle and that trade went through, and that's another one with taxes. Obviously Washington is implementing the millionaires tax this year, so
No, 2 years, a couple years,
that's
couple years, couple years. I think it starts
yeah,
2028.
but
So yeah, but again, the
yeah,
team isn't good enough. Plus, like I talked to some people, and they said he just didn't want to
right,
live there. The team's not good. They don't. He doesn't think he can win. Like Anaheim's still holding the cap space because God forbid Leo Carlson gets an offer sheet. They're going to match it. San Jose had to get to the cap floor, so they
right,
took on a lot of money. But I agree. I think he stays in Dallas. Dylan Larkin, I think you mentioned third team. I think, a lot of talk is Minnesota and Vegas don't have the assets. You're going to need a third team if Steve Yzerman's going to hold out. And I think that my gut tells me if Larkin ever does get moved, there will be a 3-team trade. My gut, that's what my gut
yeah,
tells me. Because if he wants to go to Minnesota and or Vegas or some other team, those teams don't have the assets Detroit wants. So you're going to have to get another team involved.
yeah. I mean, at some point now, at this point in the offseason, teams that were going to spend money have spent it, and then really you're going to need a facilitator to try to unload some salary, and it's going to be difficult. If it was a couple of weeks ago, it wouldn't have been a problem because obviously you wouldn't have had the money spent on other players, and now that there is, there's only so many chairs left as you're playing, looking for spots, and basically, I think he ends up staying maybe just for because it's going to be difficult for them to try to make a trade
Or it's
deal. Then,
another early season trade like we saw with Matt Duchene, where it gets resolved
yep,
early in the
yep,
season.
exactly. Yeah,
Connor
and
Hellebuyck, what do you think about there? Oh, to finish your thought on Larkin, and then you can touch on Hellebuyck.
oh yeah, no, I mean, I think plus I think you can also get to camp. I think there's gonna be a lot of teams. If there's injuries in camp, I think then you might say you see interest in players that you may not have seen right now. And I think Hellebuyck, it's going to be interesting. It sounds like Carolina really wants him. I know Buffalo thinks it's in the running. I'm not sure he goes to Buffalo, but either of those teams could use him. I mean, obviously, if Hellebuyck faces 9 shots a night like he did in Carolina, you can't imagine they're not going to have success. And Buffalo's a little more taxing, but they need a boost too because they've losing Tuck and they kind of seem to have lost a little bit of the mojo they built last year. Some of the players leaving, and Bo Byram, obviously he got well paid in Chicago, but you still got to replace him, and it's going to be up to them to try to kind of keep in the Atlantic race because, like I was saying earlier, the East is going to be better than it was last year, and that playoff spot may not be there like it was this year.
No, and like Buffalo, like Bo Byram's getting paid 12.5. He can thank Luke Hughes and Jackson and Cole for resetting the D market, getting 9 sheets. Like Nemec is going to get a decent contract in Calgary. That was a nice trade for them. I really like that. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what else happens this offseason if another offer sheet comes. If another team gets, if there are more trade actions, it feels like there could be some more things down the line. And I want to end with this cap structure. Even though in a rising cap world, you have more money to spend, Carolina, and now even New Jersey with the Nico Hischier extension, Sonny Meta talked about having cap structure, have it being important, setting a tone, guys taking less because they need to win. You're seeing it in Montreal now. Ivan Demidov gets a really good contract at 8 years, 9.15. Jacob Dobich just signed a 3-year deal, like in the fives, around like 5.5 or 5.8. But Kent Hughes basically saying, look, we're keeping this structure. Nobody's going over 10. And this is how we're going to roll and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think that is important because, again, we haven't seen a team win with multiple guys making over $10 million.
Yep. And, like I was saying earlier, I mean, the one thing they loved was those 8-year deals because you could, like, even especially guys, if you're 30 in their 30s, you could basically bury the end of the contract. And, the cap, like I said, a couple of years, the cap could be at 120. And, that's another, $15 million in 2 years for players. So a lot of GMs are banking. And honestly, if COVID hadn't happened, the cap probably would have been there by now anyway.
It might have been over 120.
Stayed flat. Yep. I mean, basically the cap was going up, a lot of revenue coming in. Now with obviously it sounds like Houston or Austin are going to get a team, which means $2 billion split 32 ways. That doesn't necessarily go into the cap structure, but that's a lot of profit for the owners, and they're building their new buildings coming up in Calgary, a lot of reconstruction in Washington of their building, and a lot more money's coming in. And obviously the one thing you got to watch in the next couple of years is the TV contract because that'll be up soon, and obviously ESPN and ABC had a really good playoff this year, and how will the NHL going to go forward? But the cap figures to go up, barring anything unexpected, and you're going to see these depth guys making a lot more money than they used to.
No, absolutely, and that's the new norm, and we got to get used to players making X amount of dollars, but it's still great to see teams working with an internal cap and understanding the value of a window and value of having guys on great contracts. And I love what Kent Hughes and Jeff Gordon said. We're going to be calculated. This is what we've done. We've done things the right way. Just because other teams are making moves, we're not going to be stupid. We're not going to spend bad dollars. We're not going to make a move just to make a move. We've always been calculated and precise, and they're still calling, and they're still going to. I have no doubt that they're going to make a move this offseason. It's just a matter of when, at some point, and when they get the right deal, because Montreal is ready to strike.
Yep. And like I was saying, too, you may have a lull until camp just because, like I said, once injuries start, guys will get traded to fill spots, guys, especially a goalie, the market hasn't been quite the same, as like the forward or defenseman market, but that could change quickly. And, you might see another flurry of activity then when teams are trying to get under the cap or figure, well, we can fill this role cheaper if we can send this guy off. And, we'll see. As I said, you probably have a couple more days of just the UFAs signing contracts, but obviously the options are getting thinner and thinner. And then, you'll see teams reassess where they are, what they want to do. And, you can go over the cap 10% until opening night. So you want to take a swing and then decide later what you want to do. Teams can do that too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be an interesting offseason. Ted, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Alex Ovechkin, the rest of free agency, the trades that we saw. We'll probably do it again in the summer at some point. Obviously there's a lull. But again, thank you so much for coming on Full Press Hockey and talking about Ovechkin and everything all this year. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's like it kind of went the way I thought, which, it was interesting and quite an ordeal. And as I said, I have a feeling we're going to do it all over again this year. But for now, we got one more year and then we'll see where it goes. Yeah,
guys, absolutely. Full Press Hockey up on YouTube. Please follow along, subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment below. Jim Biringer here. Guys, take care and enjoy the offseason.
Full Press Hockey coverage with Jim Biringer.